The hospital's sliding glass doors swished open as a petite figure stepped inside, her small feet barely making a sound on the sterile tiles. Emily, a 10-year-old girl with disheveled hair, stood trembling in the entrance. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear, exhaustion, and overwhelming responsibility. In her frail arms was a newborn baby wrapped in a faded, oversized blanket that looked like it had seen better days. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny face barely visible beneath the folds of the cloth. Emily held the child as if it were made of porcelain, delicate, fragile, and precious beyond words. Her lips quivered, and tears clung to the edges of her wide brown eyes, threatening to spill over at any moment. The weight of the situation had pushed her to the edge of her young endurance, but she stood firm, knowing she had to act. As she approached the front desk, the few nurses and doctors nearby froze in their tracks, their conversations coming to an abrupt halt. For a moment, the entire emergency room seemed to hold its breath. The sight of a child this young, carrying an infant with such determination, was a scene straight out of a nightmare or perhaps a miracle. The head nurse at the desk, a seasoned woman who had worked in the ER for over 20 years, felt her heart stop for a split second. She had seen countless traumas, but never something like this. "Sweetheart," the nurse managed, her voice betraying her disbelief. Where did you get that baby?" Emily, her voice barely a whisper, opened her mouth to speak but was momentarily silenced by the lump in her throat. Her eyes darted to the baby, and with trembling lips she answered, It's my cousin's. She couldn't bring it herself. Please, help." The room buzzed with confusion and concern. Phones were picked up, whispers spread among the staff like wildfire, and the urgency of the situation was palpable. Everyone wondered, what happened? Where was the mother? Why is this child here with a baby? The shock on their faces mirrored the disbelief the audience would surely feel watching this scene unfold. Emily came from one of those small towns that never seemed to change. Nestled between rolling hills and fields of corn, it was the kind of place where the air smelled of freshly tilled earth, and the silence was broken only by the occasional chatter of birds or the hum of a tractor in the distance. Everyone knew everyone else's business in this town. Secrets were rare, and anything unusual spread like wildfire. The town was small, but its people were proud and hardworking. Generations had lived here, their lives intertwined by long-standing family traditions and shared histories. While the town wasn't wealthy by any means, its residents valued community, always ready to help each other in times of need. Emily was part of one such family, known by everyone for their humility and work ethic. She was the youngest of 3 siblings, living in a modest house on the outskirts of town. The front porch sagged a little. The paint was peeling, but to Emily it was home. Her father worked long hours at a local construction site, while her mother pieced together part-time jobs cleaning houses and working the checkout at the grocery store. Life was never easy, but Emily had grown accustomed to it. She didn't mind wearing second-hand clothes or helping with chores long after her homework was done. What she lacked in material wealth, she made up for in compassion. She was the kind of child who would rescue a wounded bird, the one who stayed behind after school to help clean up. In some ways, she was more mature than most adults in her life, bearing her family's burdens quietly, never wanting to cause trouble or add to their struggles. Her siblings were older, already beginning to distance themselves from home. But Emily stayed close, bonded by love and loyalty to her parents, despite their financial struggles. Though she sometimes overheard her parents' whispered conversations about bills and debts, they tried to shield her from the harshest realities. The weight of responsibility, however, had always lingered in her small world, preparing her for something she could never have anticipated. A few months before the events in the hospital, Emily's world shifted when Sarah, a distant cousin, came to live with them. Sarah was 16, rebellious, and had been sent to Emily's house after her own family ran into trouble in another town. No one spoke much about why she had come or what had led to her relocation, but the whispers around town hinted at family issues, and problems at school. From the day Sarah arrived, tension simmered beneath the surface of the household. She was nothing like Emily. Moody, withdrawn, and always in trouble. She didn't seem interested in fitting into the family routine, often sneaking out late at night or spending long hours locked away in her room, listening to music on her phone with headphones jammed into her ears. Emily's parents tried their best to make Sarah feel welcome, but it was clear that her presence was creating strain, both emotionally and financially. Despite this, Emily couldn't help but feel a strange attachment to Sarah. There was something about her, something broken, that drew Emily in. She had always been a caretaker, and though Sarah was older, Emily felt a pull to take care of her in ways she didn't fully understand. It started with small things, bringing Sarah her dinner when she refused to come to the table, offering to do her laundry, and covering for her when she came home late. But as the weeks passed, Emily began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. Sarah had started gaining weight, despite rarely eating. She became secretive, and Emily caught her crying in her room more than once. There were hushed phone calls late at night and panicked looks when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Emily's parents, already overwhelmed by their own problems, didn't seem to notice. It wasn't until one night, when Emily overheard a tense argument between Sarah and her mother, that she began to piece things together. Sarah was pregnant, and she had hidden it from everyone. Emily's world shifted on its axis as she realized the gravity of the secret she had been unknowingly protecting. She wanted to tell someone, but Sarah begged her not to. She promised that everything would be fine. She just needed more time. Emily didn't know what to do. Should she betray Sarah's trust, or should she continue to keep the secret? For a girl of only 10 years, it was an impossible burden. But when the night came that Sarah collapsed, weak and unable to move, Emily knew there was no more time. She had to act. And that's how she found herself, standing in the hospital, cradling a newborn baby, waiting for help that was long overdue. When Sarah first moved into Emily's home, the atmosphere in the house changed almost instantly. She was a distant cousin, one Emily had only heard about in passing through hushed family conversations, but never really knew. Her arrival was unexpected and sudden, and the reason for her stay was never clearly explained to Emily. All she knew was that Sarah needed a place to stay, and her parents had agreed to take her in. Sarah was 16, older than Emily by 6 years, yet her presence felt like a dark cloud looming over the house. She carried an air of mystery that no one in the family seemed to want to talk about, and Emily's parents, though polite, didn't ask many questions. It was as if they had silently agreed to not pry into Sarah's past, choosing instead to focus on offering her a stable home, something Sarah clearly lacked. Sarah wasn't easy to live with. From the beginning, she was moody, withdrawn, and often locked herself away in the small guest room that had been hastily converted into her bedroom. She rarely spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary, and when she did, it was with one-word answers. She spent most of her time either sleeping or scrolling through her phone, her expression a permanent mix of sadness and frustration. Sarah's face, pale and thin, hinted at the hardship she had endured before arriving. Despite Sarah's cold exterior, Emily was fascinated by her. She sensed that Sarah had been through things that no one should have to experience, and while her parents seemed to tiptoe around the situation, Emily couldn't help but be curious. Sarah was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and Emily, who had always been more mature and compassionate than most kids her age, felt an unspoken need to understand her. The two girls were opposites in almost every way. Where Emily was quiet and reserved, Sarah was fiery and unpredictable. Where Emily sought to avoid conflict, Sarah seemed to live in it. And yet, despite these differences, Emily felt a strange sense of connection to her cousin. Maybe it was because Emily could see the sadness that lingered behind Sarah's tough exterior. Or maybe it was because, deep down, Emily knew that Sarah needed help. At first, Emily's attempts to connect with Sarah were awkward. She would knock on Sarah's door, offering her some of the snacks her mother had made, only to be met with a half-hearted thanks and the door quickly shut in her face. But Emily didn't give up. She would sit outside Sarah's room sometimes, reading books or playing with her dolls, hoping that Sarah would eventually come out and talk to her. Slowly, her persistence paid off. Sarah, though reluctant at first, began to let her guard down, just a little. She would let Emily sit in her room while she listened to music or scrolled through her phone. Occasionally, she would share vague stories about her life before coming to live with Emily's family. She talked about how her parents had split up, how things had gotten bad at home, and how she felt like she had no one left to trust. Emily listened quietly, her heart aching for her cousin. As weeks passed, Emily began to notice something unusual about Sarah. At first, it was little things. Sarah had started wearing baggy clothes, even though it was the middle of summer. She seemed to tire easily and spent more time sleeping than she did doing anything else. Emily also noticed that Sarah was gaining weight, something that didn't make sense given how little she seemed to eat. Her cousin was becoming increasingly withdrawn, avoiding conversations and spending even more time locked in her room. One night, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she overheard a tense conversation between her mother and Sarah. Emily's room was next to Sarah's, and the walls in their old house were thin, so it was easy to pick up on hushed voices through the wall. She couldn't make out every word, but what she heard was enough to leave her feeling deeply unsettled. "You need to talk to me, Sarah," Emily's mother said, her voice soft but firm. "We can't help you if you keep shutting us out." Sarah's voice was barely audible, but Emily could hear the frustration in her tone. "I told you it's fine. I'm fine. I just need more time, okay?" There was a long silence before her mother spoke again, this time sounding more concerned. "Time for what? We can't pretend everything is okay when it's not. You need to be honest with us." Emily's heart raced as she strained to hear more, but the conversation abruptly ended with the sound of Sarah's door closing. Emily lay awake for hours that night, her mind racing with questions. What was Sarah hiding? What did she need more time for? The next morning, Emily tried to ask her mother about the conversation, but her mother brushed it off, telling her that it was grown-up stuff and that she shouldn't worry about it. Frustrated, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She waited until Sarah was alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, and cautiously approached her. "Sarah," Emily began, her voice small but steady, "I heard you talking to Mom last night. Is something wrong?" Sarah stiffened but didn't turn to face her. "It's none of your business, Emily." "I know," Emily said softly, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "But I'm worried about you. You don't seem like yourself." For a moment, Sarah didn't respond. Then, without looking away from the TV, she muttered, "Just drop it, okay? You wouldn't understand." The rejection stung, but Emily wasn't about to give up that easily. "You can tell me, you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't tell anyone." Sarah finally turned to look at her, her eyes hard and filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I said drop it, Emily. Just leave me alone." Emily's confusion deepened as Sarah's behavior grew more erratic in the following days. She noticed Sarah sneaking out of the house late at night, returning hours later with a haunted expression. Emily also found Sarah crying in her room more frequently, her face buried in her pillow, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Emily's parents seemed to be oblivious to it all, too busy with their own lives, and struggles to notice what was happening right under their roof. Desperate to understand, Emily tried once again to reach out to Sarah, but every attempt was met with cold indifference. Sarah became more and more distant, locking herself in her room for days on end, avoiding the family at mealtimes, and refusing to answer any questions about her strange behavior. It was as if she was retreating into a shell, hiding from something too big for her to face. Emily felt like she was the only one who saw the truth, that something was seriously wrong with Sarah. But without anyone to confide in, she was left to wrestle with her growing fear and confusion on her own. She could feel the tension building, like a storm ready to break, but she didn't know what to do. All she could do was watch helplessly as Sarah seemed to spiral further and further into a dark, silent struggle. Then, one night, it all came to a head. Emily was jolted awake by the sound of hushed voices coming from Sarah's room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed down the hallway, pressing her ear against the door to listen. She could hear Sarah crying softly, and someone else, her mother, was speaking in a low, urgent tone. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening, Sarah," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "You need to make a decision. This isn't just about you anymore." Emily's breath caught in her throat as realization dawned. This was bigger than she had imagined, far bigger. And in that moment, she knew that something terrible was about to happen. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, and Emily's house had fallen into an unusual stillness. Her parents were both out running errands, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the old box fan in the living room and the occasional chirping of birds outside. Emily, lost in her usual routine of chores, had just finished sweeping the kitchen when she felt an odd sense of unease wash over her. Something didn't feel right. She hadn't seen Sarah all morning, and that was unusual. Despite Sarah's recent habit of hiding away in her room, she usually emerged at some point, if only to wander through the house in a daze or to avoid awkward eye contact at lunch. But today, there was no sign of her. Emily's mind flashed back to the strange conversation she'd overheard between her mother and Sarah just a few nights ago. The tension in their voices, the cryptic words, the weight of it all, it still haunted her. Worried, Emily wiped her hands on a dish towel and slowly made her way toward Sarah's room. The door was closed, as it always was, but this time there was a suffocating silence on the other side. No muffled music, no sounds of restless pacing, not even the faintest sigh. Emily knocked lightly at first, then more firmly. "Sarah," she called softly. "Are you okay?" No response. A sense of dread tightened around Emily's chest. She knocked again, louder this time. "Sarah." Still nothing. Her stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Without thinking, she grabbed the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that would be forever etched in Emily's memory. Sarah lay motionless on her bed, pale and ghost-like, her long hair sprawled across the pillow. She wasn't moving. Emily's breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the room, heart hammering. But it wasn't just Sarah's stillness that sent shockwaves of fear through her body. Beside Sarah, on the bed, wrapped in what appeared to be an old, frayed blanket, was a tiny newborn baby. The baby whimpered softly, its frail arms twitching. Emily's head spun. It was as if the world had tilted off its axis. A baby? How could this be? For a moment, Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She hadn't understood the signs, Sarah's weight gain, the secrecy, the late-night tears, and now it all came crashing down around her. Sarah had been pregnant all along, and somehow, despite living under the same roof, Emily's family had been blind to it. Emily's instincts kicked in. She rushed to Sarah's side, shaking her gently. "Sarah, Sarah, wake up," she pleaded, her voice trembling. But Sarah didn't respond. Her skin was cold to the touch, her face gaunt and drained of color. Emily's heart pounded louder, the panic rising in her throat. She had no idea what had happened or how long Sarah had been like this, but one thing was clear. They needed help. Fast. She looked at the newborn, who let out another weak cry. Its tiny face scrunched in discomfort, and Emily felt a wave of responsibility crash over her. She had no idea what to do with a baby. She was just a kid herself. But right now, it didn't matter. Sarah was unconscious, and this baby needed someone to take care of it. That someone had to be her. Her mind raced. There were no adults home, no one she could turn to for immediate help. She could call 911, but fear gnawed at her. The fear of what might happen to Sarah if the authorities got involved. Would they take the baby away? Would Sarah get into trouble? Emily wasn't old enough to understand the full scope of what could happen, but she knew enough to realize that the situation was dire and Sarah's secret would no longer be safe. I have to get help now. With shaky hands, Emily grabbed the blanket, wrapping the newborn more securely. The baby, though small and fragile, seemed oddly calm in her arms, as if trusting Emily without question. She could feel its tiny heartbeat against her chest, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world settled on her small shoulders. But there was no time to dwell on it. Emily turned toward the door, her heart racing. She had to act fast. She carefully positioned the baby in her arms, cradling it protectively as she stepped into the hallway, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. There was no time to waste. The hospital was a good 20-minute walk from their house, but it was the closest place where she knew they could get the help they needed. Without a second thought, she set off. As Emily walked quickly through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, the sun blazing overhead, the gravity of what she was doing began to sink in. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She glanced down at the baby in her arms, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, its tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. It seemed almost impossible that such a small, delicate life could have been hidden away in secret for so long. Her mind raced as she walked, battling with a moral dilemma she never thought she'd face. Should I call someone? Should I ask for help? She could feel the weight of her phone in her pocket, a lifeline just a few taps away. But the thought of calling someone filled her with dread. She didn't want to betray Sarah's trust. What if calling for help brought more trouble than it solved? What if the authorities took the baby away, or Sarah got into serious trouble for hiding the pregnancy? Emily was scared of what might happen to Sarah, scared of the unknown, but most of all, scared of making the wrong choice. She didn't want Sarah to hate her for revealing her secret, but she also knew that she couldn't just do nothing. Sarah was unconscious, and the baby needed help. This wasn't a situation Emily could handle alone. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her with every passing second. But in that moment, as she walked toward the hospital, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She would take the baby to the hospital herself. No calls, no questions, no outside help. She would protect Sarah's secret for as long as she could, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Her legs felt like lead as she neared the hospital. The towering building loomed ahead, and with each step, the knot in her stomach tightened. She knew this was the right thing to do, even though it terrified her. She clutched the baby tighter as she crossed the street, her heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. By the time Emily reached the hospital, she was drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her ears. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cool air inside hitting her like a wave of relief. The waiting room was crowded with patients, nurses, and doctors bustling about. But as soon as Emily stepped inside, everything seemed to slow. People turned to look at her, this small 10-year-old girl standing in the middle of the hospital with a newborn baby in her arms. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. The world seemed to freeze in that moment, as if time itself had paused to take in the gravity of the scene. Emily felt her throat tighten, the enormity of what she had done crashing over her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. A nurse at the front desk, noticing the pale, trembling child with the baby, rushed over. "Sweetheart, where did you get that baby?" The nurse asked, her voice gentle but urgent. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my cousin's," she said, her words shaky. She's unconscious at home. Please help her. Please help the baby." The nurse's eyes widened in shock as she signaled for help. Nurses and doctors began to swarm around Emily, taking the baby from her arms and rushing it toward the emergency room. Emily stood there, feeling like the world was spinning out of control around her, but in that moment, she knew she had done the right thing. She had saved the baby. She had made the life-altering decision to act, even though it scared her more than anything else. But as the hospital staff rushed around her, Emily realized that this was only the beginning. The secret she had protected for so long was out now, and nothing would ever be the same. The emergency room buzzed with its usual chaos. Patients on stretchers, nurses rushing between stations, and the steady beeping of monitors echoing through the sterile corridors. But when Emily entered, exhausted, pale, and trembling with fear, the scene seemed to pause. She stood in the middle of the room, clutching the newborn baby in her arms, her wide eyes darting between the faces of strangers. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her from the adrenaline and exertion of the long walk, but she forced herself to stay standing. A nurse, whose name had read Linda, was the first to notice the young girl standing there, her frail arms cradling a baby. Linda rushed over, her face etched with concern. "Sweetheart, where's your mother? Who does that baby belong to?" she asked softly, kneeling down to Emily's eye level, her gaze searching the young girl's face for answers. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the enormity of what she was about to say seemed to choke her. She knew that once she revealed the truth, everything would change. There would be no going back. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage that had brought her this far, and whispered the words that hung heavy in the air. "The baby, it's Sarah's. She's my cousin." Linda's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. Her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and compassion as she glanced down at the baby, and then back at Emily, whose small body was visibly shaking. The weight of the confession sent ripples of shock through the room. Nurses, doctors, and patients alike stopped in their tracks, overhearing the quiet words that carried so much gravity. The silence was deafening. Emily's voice trembled as she continued, her gaze fixed on the baby, tears welling up in her eyes. "Sarah didn't tell anyone. She's been hiding it. No one knew, not even my parents." Linda swallowed hard, glancing over at another nurse who had just arrived. Together, they gently took the baby from Emily's trembling arms, their faces etched with the realization of the burden this young girl had been carrying. The room around them seemed to blur, and for a moment, all anyone could focus on was the bravery of this small child who had walked into the hospital, not knowing what would happen next. "You did the right thing, honey," Linda said softly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. Her voice wavered with emotion, and Emily could see the tears glistening in her eyes. "You saved this baby." The words should have brought some relief, but instead they felt like a knife twisting in Emily's chest. The full weight of what had happened, what she had kept secret, and what she had chosen to do finally came crashing down on her. She wanted to cry, to let the tears she had been holding back for so long spill out, but there was something else she needed to say, something even more devastating. As the nurses whisked the baby away to check its vitals, Linda turned back to Emily, her expression filled with compassion. "We'll take care of the baby now. We'll help Sarah too, I promise." "Where is she now, Emily?" Emily felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow and ragged. She wasn't finished. There was more to tell, something she had been too afraid to admit until now. "Sarah," she started, her voice barely audible. "Sarah didn't want to keep the baby." Linda's eyes widened. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. The room seemed to grow even quieter as everyone leaned in, waiting for Emily's next words. Emily's voice faltered, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to say it. She planned to leave the baby. She didn't want anyone to know. She was going to abandon it after she gave birth. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating everyone within earshot. Linda's hand instinctively flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as the full weight of Emily's revelation hit her. The room, already frozen in shock, seemed to reel with the intensity of what Emily had just confessed. It was almost too much to process. The idea that Sarah, a teenage girl who had been struggling silently for so long, had planned to walk away from her newborn child was devastating. But what hit everyone even harder was the realization that Emily, a 10-year-old girl, had known all along and had chosen to act when no one else could. Emily had made the decision to bring the baby to safety, to protect it, even when the situation was far too complicated and overwhelming for a child her age. The doctors and nurses exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief, sorrow, and awe. One of the doctors, a tall, graying man named Dr. Collins, stepped forward, his voice low and somber. "You've been carrying this secret all by yourself, haven't you?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Sarah made me promise not to tell. She was scared. She didn't know what to do. But I couldn't. I couldn't let her leave the baby. I had to do something." The room seemed to hold its breath again, as the sheer enormity of what Emily had done began to sink in. The doctors and nurses weren't just shocked by Sarah's plan. They were overwhelmed by the bravery and selflessness of this small girl who had taken on a burden no child should ever have to bear. Dr. Collins knelt beside Emily, his hand resting gently on her arm. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "what you did today, it took incredible courage. You may have just saved 2 lives, Sarah's and the baby's." Emily's lip quivered, and she finally let the tears spill over. She had been holding them in for so long, trying to be strong. But now, in the face of all the kindness and compassion surrounding her, she couldn't hold back any longer. The sobs came in waves, and Linda pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her as she cried. "You did the right thing, Emily," Linda whispered. "You did the right thing." The nurses, some of them mothers themselves, wiped tears from their eyes as they watched the scene unfold. Even the doctors, who were used to dealing with trauma and life-altering situations, were visibly shaken. The entire room seemed to be enveloped in a sense of shared sorrow and admiration for Emily's bravery. One by one, the nurses and doctors offered quiet words of comfort to Emily, telling her how proud they were of her, how strong she had been. Emily, still wrapped in Linda's arms, could barely comprehend the flood of emotions that had overcome her. She had been so scared, so unsure of what would happen. But now, in the arms of people who understood the weight of her decision, she felt a glimmer of relief. But beneath the relief was an aching sadness for Sarah, who had felt so lost and hopeless that she believed abandoning her baby was the only way out. Emily didn't blame her cousin, though. She understood, in a way that no one else seemed to, just how scared Sarah had been. She had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes, the way she had pushed everyone away, and she knew that Sarah hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. She had just been overwhelmed by a situation that no one her age should have to face alone. The hospital staff moved quickly to prepare for Sarah's arrival, sending a team to Emily's house to bring her cousin in for immediate care. Emily knew that Sarah would be taken care of now, that the baby would be safe, and that everything was finally out in the open. But she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt, wondering if there was something she could have done sooner to help her cousin. Would things have been different if she had spoken up earlier? If she had told her parents what was really going on? As the hospital staff worked swiftly to stabilize the baby and prepare for Sarah's arrival, the ripple effect of Emily's decision spread throughout the hospital. Word of the young girl's bravery and the secret she had carried reached every corner of the building. And soon, people who hadn't even been in the ER at the time were talking about the girl who had saved her cousin's baby. Some were moved to tears by the story. Others were left in awe of Emily's strength, and a few even began to question their own actions, wondering if they, too, would have had the courage to make the same choice if they were in her shoes. But for Emily, the true impact of her decision was still sinking in. She had protected the baby, but the weight of the situation was far from over. There would be questions, there would be consequences, and there would be a long road ahead for both Sarah and the baby. And though she didn't know what the future would hold, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The hospital, as a mandated reporter of any incident involving a minor and a baby, wasted no time in contacting Child Protective Services, CPS. The call was swift and efficient, but it set off a chain reaction that would reverberate through the quiet town like an earthquake. Within an hour, CPS officials were en route, and Sarah's family had been informed of the situation. What had started as a heartbreaking secret carried by a 10-year-old girl had now grown into a full-blown emergency that no one could ignore. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Emily's parents arrived at the hospital shortly after receiving a frantic call from the hospital staff, their faces pale with shock. Emily's mother, Catherine, was beside herself with guilt. She stood frozen as a nurse explained what had happened, how Sarah had hidden her pregnancy, how Emily had bravely stepped up to save the baby when no one else knew. But all Catherine could think about was how blind she had been. How had she not seen the signs? How had she missed what was happening right under her own roof? Tears welled up in her eyes as she rushed to embrace Emily. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have known. I should have seen something." Emily, though emotionally drained, clung to her mother, seeking comfort. But even as she held on to her mother's reassuring embrace, the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on her young shoulders. She had done what she could to help Sarah, but now that the secret was out, the consequences were spiraling out of control. The town itself was small and close-knit, where news traveled faster than anyone could keep up with. Within hours, everyone had heard about Sarah's pregnancy, the abandoned baby, and Emily's heroic actions. People whispered about it in the grocery store, in the local diner, and at church. Neighbors exchanged hushed conversations, and families gathered at dinner tables to discuss the shocking revelation. The townspeople, who had once thought of Sarah as a troubled, rebellious teen who'd been shipped off to relatives because of behavior problems, now saw her in a much different light. Some were sympathetic, understanding that Sarah had been dealing with something far more serious than anyone had realized. Others were less kind, quick to judge Sarah for trying to hide the baby and abandon it. She should have come forward, they said. She should have asked for help. Emily's family, meanwhile, was at the center of the storm. Catherine, heartbroken, couldn't bear to face the neighbors, feeling as though she had failed Sarah, Emily, and even herself. James, Emily's father, was a man of few words, but the disappointment on his face was palpable. He had always prided himself on being a protector of his family, yet somehow his own niece had been suffering in silence, right under his roof. The family dynamic shifted dramatically in those first few days. Emily, once the quiet and thoughtful child who never caused trouble, was now seen as the hero who had saved an innocent life. Her actions brought her parents immense pride, but also a sense of deep sorrow that their daughter had been forced to carry such a heavy burden. They tried to shield her from the harsh judgments twirling around the town, but Emily could sense the tension, the unease in every interaction. As soon as CPS arrived at the hospital, the situation escalated. Sarah, still weak from childbirth and emotionally distraught, was taken into protective custody for evaluation. Doctors determined that while she was physically stable, her mental state was fragile, teetering on the edge of breakdown. The social workers had no choice but to involve law enforcement, given the complexity of the case. Emily's family was interviewed extensively, trying to piece together how Sarah had managed to hide her pregnancy for so long and why she hadn't sought help. Emily, still shaken, explained everything she knew, how she had suspected something was wrong, how Sarah had begged her to keep quiet, and how, in the end, she had decided to act to save the baby. The baby, meanwhile, was placed in temporary foster care until the legal system could determine what would happen next. It was clear that Sarah was in no condition to care for a newborn, and with the truth about the situation still unraveling, the authorities were cautious about rushing any decisions. The ripple effect spread beyond the immediate family. Schools, churches, and community centers became hotbeds of discussion. People debated who was to blame, how the town had failed to protect a young girl like Sarah, and what should happen to her now. Some argued that Sarah needed compassion and mental health support. Others, more judgmental, insisted she had made her bed and should lie in it. In the midst of the chaos, Just as the town was settling into its collective shock, a bombshell was dropped, a twist that no one had seen coming. After a series of interviews with CPS and law enforcement, it was revealed that Sarah wasn't the biological mother of the baby after all. The truth, when it came out, left everyone reeling. Sarah had been hiding the baby, but not because she had given birth to it. She had been protecting the child from its real parents, a troubled couple who lived in a nearby town. Sarah had known the couple through mutual acquaintances, and when she learned that they were unfit to care for their baby, she had stepped in to help. The mother of the child had battled addiction, and the father had been abusive. The baby had been born into a dangerous and unstable home, and Sarah, despite her young age, had felt compelled to take the child and hide it, hoping to keep it safe from harm. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community once again, this time shifting the entire narrative. Sarah wasn't the neglectful, irresponsible teenager everyone had assumed she was. Instead, she had taken on an extraordinary burden, trying to shield an innocent child from a life of abuse and neglect. Her actions, though misguided, were born out of a desperate attempt to do the right thing, something that no one had expected. Suddenly, the town's view of Sarah shifted once more. The judgment and criticism that had been heaped upon her began to melt away, replaced by sympathy and understanding. People who had once whispered harsh words behind her back now spoke of her with a sense of admiration. It became clear that Sarah, like Emily, had been forced into an impossible situation, trying to protect a life while dealing with overwhelming odds. The unexpected twist deepened the moral complexity of the situation. Sarah's actions were not black and white. On one hand, she had hidden the baby and planned to abandon it because she didn't know what else to do. On the other hand, she had done so to protect the child from a life of suffering at the hands of unfit parents. The town, once quick to judge, now found itself grappling with the difficult questions Sarah's actions raised. When is it right to intervene in someone else's life? How far should a person go to protect someone else's child? And what happens when a young person is forced to act like an adult before they're ready? The authorities, too, faced a complicated legal situation. Sarah had technically kidnapped the baby, but her motivations had been pure. In the end, it was decided that Sarah would not face criminal charges, but instead, she would be placed in therapy and a foster care system better equipped to support her emotional needs. The baby, after a lengthy legal process, was eventually placed with a loving family that could provide the stable home Sarah had tried so hard to create. As the dust settled, the town began to heal. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale of hidden struggles, lost innocence, and the complexities of doing what's right in a world full of gray areas. Emily's family, though forever changed by the events, found a way to move forward. Catherine, still filled with guilt over not seeing the signs, became a more vocal advocate for children in difficult situations. She began volunteering at local shelters and speaking at community events about the importance of paying attention to the unseen struggles of those around us. Emily, though still young, emerged from the ordeal stronger and more self-assured. She had faced an impossible choice and had made the right decision, even when it felt overwhelming. The town would never forget her bravery, and for years to come, people would tell the story of how a 10-year-old girl saved a baby and changed her town forever. The community, once fractured by judgment and gossip, came together in the end, recognizing the importance of compassion, understanding, and listening to those who are most vulnerable. And though Sarah's journey was far from over, she now had the support she needed to heal, knowing that her actions, though flawed, had ultimately saved a life. The events surrounding Sarah, Emily, and the baby rippled through the town, hospital, and even Emily's home in ways no one could have anticipated. Each person who had been touched by the story found themselves reflecting on what had happened and what it meant for their lives and the community as a whole. In the hospital, the nurses and doctors who had witnessed Emily's courage still talked about that fateful day. Linda, the nurse who had first taken the baby from Emily's arms, couldn't shake the image of the brave little girl standing alone in the emergency room, exhausted but determined. She had seen many cases in her career, tragic, hopeful, and everything in between. But Emily's story stayed with her in a way none of the others had. "I've never seen a child so strong," Linda would say later, recounting the events to her colleagues. The weight she was carrying. It was far too much for someone her age, but she did it. She did what no one else could. Doctors like Dr. Collins found themselves deeply moved by the complexity of Sarah's situation. They had initially judged her, thinking she was another teenager who had made poor choices. But the revelation that Sarah had been protecting the baby from harm, that she had been fighting a moral battle no one knew about, shattered those preconceived notions. "We think we've seen it all," Dr. Collins reflected during a meeting with his peers, "but sometimes the most complicated battles are fought by the people we least expect." Back in town, the shock of the event had transformed the quiet community. At first, there had been whispers, rumors about what had happened, speculation about who was at fault. But as the truth emerged, the town found itself grappling with more profound questions. How had a pregnant teenager, hiding a baby, gone unnoticed by so many? How had the people who were supposed to care for and support their neighbors missed something so significant? The community, once judgmental and quick to gossip, began to see the situation through a different lens. Sarah's story wasn't just about her mistakes. It was about a system and a town that had failed to notice when someone was in crisis. The more compassionate members of the community came forward to offer support, organizing fundraisers to help cover the costs of Sarah's therapy and care. Churches and community groups began offering resources for teenagers in crisis, and a new openness emerged among the townspeople, a willingness to talk about difficult things that had previously been ignored. Emily's family, meanwhile, was dealing with their own emotional reckoning. Catherine, Emily's mother, was still haunted by guilt. She had always prided herself on being a loving and attentive mother, but how had she not seen what Sarah was going through? Catherine found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she could have done differently. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she resolved to be more present, more attentive, in the future, to never again assume that everything was fine just because nothing seemed wrong on the surface. James, Emily's father, was equally shaken but less vocal about it. He was a man who believed in protecting his family, and the fact that he hadn't seen the danger Sarah had been in hurt his pride. He threw himself into work, but in quieter moments, he found himself looking at Emily with a new sense of awe. His daughter had stepped up when he hadn't, and though he was proud, he also felt a deep sadness that she had needed to do so. And then there was Emily. In the eyes of many, Emily was a hero. People in town praised her bravery, and some even went as far as to call her a guardian angel for the baby she had saved. Friends and neighbors brought her small gifts, tokens of appreciation for what she had done. And at school, her classmates looked at her with a mix of admiration and awe. She was the girl who had saved a life, who had done what no one else could. But Emily didn't feel like a hero. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world seemed far away, she wrestled with everything that had happened. The weight of the secret she had carried for so long still hung heavy in her heart, and while she knew she had done the right thing in the end, there were nights when she lay awake, wondering if she could have done more. Could she have told someone sooner? Could she have found a way to help Sarah before everything spiraled out of control? In those moments, Emily felt the full burden of her decisions, and it overwhelmed her. The praise she received didn't ease the guilt she felt over Sarah's suffering. She missed the days before everything had changed, before Sarah's arrival, before the baby, before the hospital. Things had been simpler then, and Emily found herself longing for the normalcy that had been lost. She struggled with her new role in the family as well. Her parents now looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. They tried to protect her from the emotional fallout, but Emily could see the strain in their eyes, the guilt they carried for not noticing what she had been dealing with. She didn't want to be the brave one anymore. She just wanted to go back to being a kid. As the weeks turned into months, The town began to rebuild itself in the wake of the events. The community's shift toward compassion and reflection brought people closer together. The town, once known for its gossip and judgment, became a place where people started to look out for one another more carefully. Schools implemented new programs for at-risk youth, and local organizations increased their efforts to provide mental health support for teenagers and young adults. Sarah, after spending time in therapy and receiving the care she so desperately needed, slowly began to heal. The baby, who had initially been placed in foster care, was eventually adopted by a loving family that lived nearby. Sarah visited the child often, finding solace in knowing that the baby she had protected was safe and cared for. Though Sarah's life would never be the same, she had been given a second chance, one that she wouldn't take for granted. For Emily's family, healing was a slower process. Catherine and James worked hard to rebuild trust with their daughter, trying to create a space where Emily could be a child again, free from the burdens she had carried. They spent more time together as a family, going on walks, playing games, and reconnecting in small, meaningful ways. But Emily had changed. She was more thoughtful now, more aware of the complexities of life. She had learned that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't easy, and that being brave didn't always feel good. She carried the lessons of that fateful day with her, lessons that shaped the way she saw the world and her place in it. As Emily reflected on everything that had happened, she couldn't help but wonder about the nature of choice. One decision, her decision to take the baby to the hospital, had changed everything. It had saved a life, altered the course of her cousin's future, and transformed her family and town. But it had also taken something from her: her innocence, her sense of safety in the world. Would things ever return to normal? And what was normal, anyway? She often sat by her bedroom window, watching the town go about its quiet routines, and asked herself, did I make the right choice? Could I have done more? But as time passed, Emily realized that there was no perfect answer. Life was full of difficult choices, and sometimes all you could do was what felt right in the moment. She had done what she believed was best to protect the baby, and though the consequences had been far-reaching, they had also brought growth, healing, and hope to those around her. The video closes with Emily's final thoughts, but not before posing a question to the viewers. What would you have done in my shoes? Could you have kept Sarah's secret? Could you carry the weight of a decision like this? The screen fades to black, leaving the audience to ponder Emily's journey and encouraging them to share their thoughts and stories in the comments, creating a space for reflection, discussion, and empathy. The story ends, but its impact lingers, both on the town and on the audience, reminding everyone that sometimes, even the smallest decisions can change everything.